Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. The topic that set the internet on fire this week is why the sudden flip in Macron's rhetoric around Ukraine, and why is he suddenly leading the strongmanship on Ukraine's defense?
I am Nicolas Tenzer. I am a guest professor at Sciences Po Paris. I am an expert in security and foreign policy. I am writing a book. I wrote many books, in fact, but my last book is about the war in Ukraine, and the title of the book is All War, Crime and Oblivion. It will be translated very soon in Ukrainians and other languages. And I'm also senior fellow at CEPA, and I used to work for the government as a government official.
Oh, that's amazing. I will be waiting forward for your book, whether it be in English or in Ukrainian. I'll make sure to buy it and read it. So thank you for joining us today. And I guess for our viewers, I will summarize a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. And that's, I guess, self-explanatory, provided that this channel is about Ukraine, is kind of both French politics and French policy in the framework of the war in Ukraine. So my first question would likely be, what is the political climate in France like right now? Because for me, in the beginning of the invasion, I guess Emmanuel Macron was one of the most reserved European leaders in terms of wanting to be very strict on Russia. And it seemed like he was taking it very carefully and very cautiously. And now Emmanuel Macron is one of the most forwardly against Russia leaders in the entirety of the European Union. So what do you think provoked that shift, and why, and sort of how is, why do you think his politics has changed, and do you think I'm seeing it right?
Well, basically, I think that we were many. I mean, basically, to warn Emmanuel Macron, about the risk to cozy up to Russia. And I think it was already, at the beginning of his first term. In 2017, you remember, he received Vladimir Putin. He was one of the first foreign guests in Versailles Castle. Of course, he was very strong in denouncing the propaganda, but he was at that time expecting to create a kind of reset with Russia. And then he met again with Putin in Brégançon. It was in 2019, and he was talking about a new architecture of security and trust, not the word, with Russia. And we were many also to say directly to him and to write also pieces, in the press, to make interviews, things that completely misleading, that we very well known at the very nature of Russia, under Putin's yoke. We perfectly know all the crimes that Putin has committed. In Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria, in Ukraine already in 2014, and after that. And so it's just impossible to break a kind of deal with Russia, because we perfectly know, and something that I was warning since basically 15 years, about the threat posed by Russia. It will be either Putin or us. There could be no way, basically, to calm down Putin and to appease him. It's completely speaking, but still, Macron continues. It's this kind of very risky gamble to consider that there could be a kind of agreement with Putin. And all the persons, also in France, who basically disagreed with Macron on that, was in a way sidelined, in the decision-making process. And I think it was a very bad thing for France. But at the end of the day, and after, when we had the war, the all-out war, coming on February 24th, 2022, then Macron again tried to appease Russia. He was confident that he could convince Putin, and he was talking even of providing Russia with security guarantee. He was talking about the alleged brotherhood between the Ukrainian and the Russian people. He was talking about, we must not humiliate Russia. And that was completely blunders. No one basically understood, among the foreign policy analysts, and also many people, at the ministries of foreign affairs or Ministry of Defense, why he was talking this. But after that, after 1 year, I think that finally he understood. Of course, we were many, of course, to talk to him, to say that he has to revise his positions. And finally, I mean, the turning point was the speech he delivered in Bratislava on May 31st, 2023, in which he said basically we were completely blind. We didn't pay attention about the warning issued by many people, of course, in other European countries, especially the Eastern and Central European countries. And that was a kind of U-turn. And the U-turn began at that date. And after that, there was a second step, which was very important in my view, which was on February 26, 2024, so of this year, where Macron took up one of my very long-standing position, in fact, since February 24th, 2022, in which he said basically we must not accept red lines coming from Russia. We have to set our own red lines, and we cannot rule out the possibility to send European troops to Ukraine just to protect the Ukrainians, of course, to train the Ukrainian servicemen and women, but also maybe it will be needed one way or another at the end of the day to fully win the war. Of course, there was a lot of outrage, in France, also in other countries, saying that it was irresponsible behavior. In my view, that was a real turning point. And I really applauded at that time Macron for being, the first one to propose that. And still today, that's something which is on the table. I wrote with other people an op-ed in Le Monde, which is the leading newspaper in France, saying that no, Macron must basically enforce, his ID and fulfill his promises, which is very important. Having said that, I think that's quite important to know that, but I think we can go even further. Especially, I think that France is doing a lot in providing, weapons to Ukraine. Especially, you will have next year Mirage 2000 fighter jets fully revised to fit with the Ukrainian needs that will come, in the Ukrainian skies, which is good. France has already provided very long range or medium range missiles, basically Scalp, like Storm Shadows. And basically, Macron was in favor in launching deep strikes into Russian territory without any kind of the reservations that the US was prompt to set. But having said that, I think we can go even further, especially in speaking louder and louder about the crimes committed by the Russians, in Ukraine. Basically 4 categories of crimes, as we know: war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide, and crime of aggression. And I think on that, France certainly was supposed basically to comply with the international law, as to be more vocal on this dimension. It's quite important also to alert, the French public and more generally the European opinions about the necessity not only to protect the Ukrainians, but also to defeat Russia. And I think we have certainly to have, in the president's talks, more about we have to defeat Russia without any kind of reservation.
Yeah, it's actually a great explanation. Thank you for that. I do agree with you with this very swift change of rhetoric, and I do agree with you that it started around a year ago and really solidified very recently. And when I was posing this question, right, it's because I think. To be very honest, as a Ukrainian, as an unbiased journalist, obviously I have to just look at political climates and at a relationship with Russia between different countries to understand why certain leaders act a certain way. As a biased Ukrainian, right, Macron was one of my least favorite leaders for a very long time in the EU, and recently he's one of my favorite leaders because of how his rhetoric has changed. So while he, it seems, has finally understood that this is not a local conflict. It's a precursor to a global war that can either be stopped by showing force to Russia or perpetuated by folding to Russia, right? Do you think the French society understands that? Because, for instance, in the United States, Biden authorizing Storm Shadows has caused a huge caused a huge outrage among the probably 50% of the American population, maybe 40%. Because people think that showing force to Russia is in fact going to cause World War III. And that makes Biden even less popular. while in reality showing force to Russia prevents World War III. What do you think the French society thinks of this? Does the French society see Macron's change of rhetoric as good, or are people as kind of like afraid as they are in the United States? And do you think people understand that this is not a localized conflict? Sorry, it's a very broad question.
Well, well, I think I have. I will try to depict a kind of contrasted figures about the state of the French society. The first thing is that let's be very clear, which is good. First of all, you have a huge support for the Ukrainian in France. According to all the opinion polls, basically, the French people understand that basically the Ukrainian people are the victims of the war, that they have they don't have any kind of responsibility, of course, in this war, and that the guilty one basically is Russia. And I think that's a huge change since, before February 24th, 2022. Before that, there was a kind of sympathy for the Russians. There was a kind of feeling of basically Russia could be an ally. And now, basically, the huge majority of the French people, even the voters for the far right, consider Russia a threat. And not only a threat for the Ukrainians, but also a threat for Europe and for France. And I think that's a huge change. Having said that, first of all, we have to understand, but that I mean the case is most of the European societies, especially in the West and the South of Europe, I would say that majority of the French people basically do not really care. Because they do not really know. They know that there is a war, but if they consider what their more important thing for them, they will talk about the purchasing power, they will talk about the inflation, they will talk about the price of energy, they will talk about the insecurity, they will talk about the migrants, depending of the side of the political spectrum, of course. But basically, they won't consider the war in Ukraine as something which is basically a vital thing. Very unfortunately, I say that. Because of what? Because of the fact that most of the French political leaders, including the president or the prime minister, are not talking day after day about the vital threat posed by Russia. Even if you have very strong talks very recently by the ministers of armed forces, Sébastien Lecornu, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, also Jean-Noël Barrot, who were talking very clearly about the risk of war, about the war in Europe, about the fact there is a war, basically, and we are part, of the world. Most of the French people, they remember what Macron was saying some weeks or months ago, we are not at war with Russia. But in fact, the question is not if we are at war with Russia. The fact is basically that Russia is at war with us. And I think we have to talk more about to the French people about the reality of the war. That's the second thing. The third thing and the last thing is that we are in a kind of huge political turmoil right now because of the huge deficit. And it was a very strict and very strong warning by the European Commission that we have certainly to reduce, the deficit. We have to reduce the debt. And in fact, at the same time, we certainly will have, and I think that's certainly the things that the President and also the Minister of Armed Forces are aware of, and many experts, we will have to increase dramatically at the same time the budget of defense. Not only, to provide new weapons to Ukraine, and we will have to, because we are not doing enough, but also basically to protect ourselves. Now, the French budget is about 2% of the GDP, and I think that all the European countries, including Germany, France, and also the UK, which is a European country, if not a EU country, we must have as an objective to go to 4%. And so the question is, we have to find economy basically to diminish the deficit of the budget from, let's say, 60 billion euros, and at the same time we will have to find 60 billion euros more for the defense budget. And in order to do that, which means very concretely sacrifice for the social security, for the hospital, for the training, for the school, many things, we have to explain to the French people, but also to the German, Italian, Spanish, etc., why we have to make this kind of sacrifice. So we have to dramatize more, what's at stake right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that a lot of the the people that don't understand why we need to do this look at this wrong, because they look at the war as we are helping Ukraine, we're giving money to Ukraine, we are giving money to this country to win, but what is this country to us, right? But the objective of all of this is not for Ukraine to win per se, it's to defeat Russia, because Ukraine is not an
Absolutely.
issue, Russia is the issue. And I think that the rhetoric needs to change to explain that this is not about begging Ukraine, it's about defeating Russia, because Russia is a problem for all of us and Ukraine is just standing between us and Russia. And if there wasn't Ukraine, then we would be having this problem and we would be the country that would need help from the United States or from somewhere else to continue fighting, right? And no one wants to end up in a World War II as depicted in books and movies where there are battlefields all over Europe, right? So I think it's that thing. I also wanted to say that when you said that, the majority of the French population understands that Ukraine is the victim here and that Ukraine needs to fight, I can't help but be cheesy and say this is what I would expect from the nation that invented Viva la Révolution. So it makes sense.
Yes, of course.
So it makes sense to me. And then my next point is, so you said that even the far-right voters understand the threat of Russia. That's very interesting to me, because Marine Le Pen herself seems to be very much of a Russian friend, and this is an assumption. Obviously, there is no concrete proof of that, even though she is on trial for embezzlement, right? It seems like Russia and Russian trolls have done to Marine Le Pen have given Marine Le Pen similar sort of help as they have given Trump, as in they have boosted her rhetoric online, they have helped her views be more evident and more available to the French voters. So interesting that the far right would be, and the far right voters would be seeing Russia as a threat when the person who's running on the far right is Russia's friend, and very openly so.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's very interesting. But the problem is that when we study, the opinion polls, and that's something very classical in political science, basically we have to understand that the people are weighting, their analysis depending of their own concerns. So basically the people could say, on the one hand, okay, we perfectly know that Mrs. Le Pen and the far right basically are backed by Russia, and in fact that they have a very mild stance, to say it politely, vis-à-vis Russia at the same time. That we perfectly know. And we personally, we consider Russia a threat, we oppose Russia, we don't like Mr. Putin, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, but just see, what the main reason for which we will vote for Mrs. Le Pen, they will say, the electorate of the far right, is basically because she's the only one against the invasion of migrants, of course, as they say. They are against Islam. They will basically do much more for our own security, because we are living in very insecure cities right now. So she will take active measures. And of course, she will do a lot for the purchasing power of the poor people, and she against the elite, and we want to get rid of the traditional political class, the traditional elites. The kind of speech that we are also witnessing, of course, is in the US, even is, of course, Trump or Musk basically are part of the elites, certainly. But you have this kind of very old rhetoric, in France, many other countries as well. And so basically the people won't vote because Marine Le Pen is, in a way, very complacent towards Russia, but we will vote for her in spite she is complacent.
I see. Yeah, it makes sense.
That's the point. And that's why I was just saying before that, that in the mind of the people, of course, the war is very important, but that's not the major point for them.
Yeah.
Their major point of attention.
Yeah.
Because we are not, that of course, as I said, dramatizing enough And we are not saying very clearly that Russia must lose because of our own interest. And because after that, they will have a lot of virtuous effects, not only on Ukraine, but also on Georgia, Moldova, the global security. Just see also what happened in Africa with, of course, the lot of the Russian mercenaries, creating more insecurity. And if we have more insecurity in Africa, basically it will have an effect in Europe because we will
Yeah.
have, of course, an opportunity for the jihadist movement also to gain power and traction.
Well, also interestingly, the people that are against the migrant invasion, right? What they're not taking into account is that Russia's meddling in Africa actually will result in a lot of French-speaking African migrants coming to France because destabilization of Africa leads to people looking for going somewhere else. So that would actually influence a lot more migrant crisis than people are already perceiving there to be, right? Um, do you
Absolutely.
do you think that Marine Le Pen and her party have a chance of winning next time? And if so, what do you think that would do to the policy, to the Ukraine-related policy?
Well, basically, I cannot rule out that Marine Le Pen or someone of her party, because there is a judgment pending of the possibility for her, of course, to compete for the next election. I won't comment on that precisely because we don't know. But there is still a possibility, I mean, for her to win, or someone of her party. I was mentioning the head of the
Yeah.
official head of the party, Jordan Bardella, who is a MEP. I mean, that's unfortunately a possibility because I do not know who will be, I mean, the competitors, in the race in 2027. And I don't have to comment. I think it's not very interesting, I mean, to
Yeah.
say who will be, who won't be. But if we see the general tendency of the rise of the far right in many Western democracies, including, of course, the US, it could happen in France. And then, what will be the consequences? The consequences, it will be absolutely terrible because I think that any kind of effort, military effort, but also financial effort to Ukraine will be immediately stopped. We will have, of course, a lot of new networks of Russian influence pouring, into France. We have already many, as we know, but there will be certainly others. The position, of course, of France will be dramatically weakened, in Europe, but also on the world stage. I think there will be absolutely no credibility of France, in NATO or of course, in the UN or in the EU. I think that will be a lot of concern by our allies to share also intelligence with the French authorities. So basically, I mean, France, in this case, and especially if you have, of course, a majority of the far right in the parliament after the presidential election of 2027, I mean, there will be a state captured by Russia. I have to.
Yeah.
We have to speak very bluntly. We are also right now. We are still asking about what could be the counterweight, the checks and balances, in the U.S. system. But in my view, there will be less checks and balances in the French system that still we have in the U.S.
Yeah, well, interestingly, I mean, well, you know, obviously the French system a lot better than than I do, but I do know the U.S. system, and I think that European parliaments in general have a lot more checks and balances than the U.S. does, because in the U.S. these checks and balances can easily be unbalanced if one party, two-party system, right, takes over all of the branches of the government, which they did this time around, and that would not be, it wouldn't be possible to happen in France in a certain way, right? It wouldn't be possible to happen in a lot of other countries. So I guess it depends on perspective. For me, France has a lot more checks and balances than the U.S. does, but that could be argued from both sides. It's very interesting, the possibility of the far right win in a lot of European countries, because to me, it's while I'm obviously very worried about it as a Ukrainian, because I fully understand what that means, as someone who is very interested in politics and has always kept up with it. It worries me even more because if the far right rises, say in France and Germany, in the biggest allied countries, because it already rose in the United States, then of course, sure, for a couple of years, it's going to be very terrible for Ukraine and it's going to be very good for Russia. But at the end of the day, in a decade, it's going to collapse and things are going to get even worse. I do see a tendency that during world destabilization and crisis, as we've seen in World War II as well, far-right leadership tends to kind of gain a lot of favorability because they seem to have, and I'm going to use very unprofessional language here, more balls. and people want
Yes.
and people want like the population wants people in power who appear to be more strongmanish. But it's interesting because it's a very it's a fallacy, because at the end of the day, it ends up actually draining all of the resources out of the population, and then the population revolts. So that prospect is really terrifying for me across Europe. I do really hope that, Russia doesn't have as much grip on Germany and France and the UK and Italy as it does on the post-Soviet satellites like Romania. For instance, I think that it's easier for Russia to influence the elections in post-Soviet satellites because there is already more framework for their informational
Absolutely.
operations there. And there is also language familiarity and everything like that. Although I will say that in a lot of Russian movies and TV, there is a lot of romanticization of France, and there is a lot of Russian culture influence in France in terms of the great poets and writers and the imperial Russia having spoken French and stuff. Do you think that that plays any role in how your average French person perceives not the Russian government and not Russia, but Russians and their culture and stuff like that?
Well, I think that it used certainly to play a role because there was a kind of rosy romanticism, that was very common, in many intellectual and political circles,
Yeah.
in Paris, and then of course infused, in the general public as well. But just remember, before the All-Out War, what Macron was saying. Macron was saying about the greatness of St. Petersburg,
Yeah.
the Russian literature, the Russian music, blah blah blah. There was this kind of idea, which is quite important right now. Is that in France, of course, that's a minority of intellectuals who know that they are beginning also to rediscover the Ukrainian literature and art. And I think it's quite important, of course, to make the larger public know that there was a kind of imperialistic grip of Russia on the other cultures of the former Soviet Empire.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite important to say that you have this kind of other culture. And I remember I wrote a piece, on my strategy blog, Tenzer Strategic, and the piece was republished by the Kiev Post on Ala because in one of my trip to Ukraine in last April, I saw in Kiev the exhibition of in the Ukrainian house of Ala the Ukrainian artist, whom you certainly know, who was murdered by the NKVD in 1970. Who made a lot, of course, to establish the truth about being an artist of the Bikivnia forest massacres, but also on Babin Yar. And I think quite important. And she has a real, something. And you have a lot of also writers, novelists, who are also now translated into French. And I think it's quite important to say, but well, we have Russian, of course, but you don't have only Russians. And you had also a lot of artists who were labeled Russians, but in fact they were not Russian. They were Ukrainian, they were Georgian, they were Belarusians. They were, and it's important to change the mindset of the people and to understand there is absolutely no grandeur or greatness, of Russia after what he did. And in the conclusion of my very long essay on Alaorska, I wrote about we have now to consider Russia a petty country. A petty country because of what it did.
Yeah.
And there will be no, reverence to Russia. I am not saying that we have to cancel, what the Russian artist did. That's not the point. But the point is that when you had a country committing so many murders, we have certainly to question its own culture. Not saying that all the Russian artists of the, of course, 19th century was responsible for that. Certainly not. And we can even not say that Wagner was responsible for the murders committed by the Nazis in Germany. But still, I think it's quite important also, and it was important after World War II, to re-question part of the German culture.
Yeah.
Because the German culture cannot be completely separated from what came next, which was Nazism.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I think I always say this, I say that the way that people perceive kind of the Soviet Union and the way that people perceive Putin today is very often it says like, oh, Putin's war, or, Putin did this, average Russians are not to blame. But if you look at Russian history, they have never had a democracy, and it's always a Tsar that they follow. And if you look at Russian history, it's always Russians seeing themselves as above everyone else in the world. And, Hitler existed in prominently in 3 generations, the kids, the adults, and the elderly of that time, right? And of course, there's still awful, awful people that follow his ideology, but it's not en masse. En masse, he existed in 3 generations. Russian imperialism and Russia's idea that they're above everyone else in the world has existed for centuries throughout all of their leaders. So, if people after World War II were sort of like looking to re-educate Germans and understood that it's not about just Hitler, it's about the society and how the society perceives, the world. I hope that people everywhere in the world will start understanding that in Russia it is very much about society, because Putin is a product of Russia. It's not the other way around. And the methods that we're seeing him use are the methods of the KGB that have been used for more than a century at this point. And before that, they were the methods of the Imperial Russians as well. So it's kind of, it's all interconnected, and it's really about the Russian culture and the Russian society, because I think that good artists and good, bright thinkers are the exception, not the rule, while we see Russia as good and bright thinkers are the rule, and then people like Putin are the exception, when it's the other way around, really.
Absolutely, because, I devoted an entire chapter, in my book about that, and also many of my essays, on my blog, because I do consider, of course, we can say that Putin, of course, must be brought to court, must be accountable, must be punished for all the crimes committed, because he was the real instigators. But I fully agree with you that there must be, after the war, there must be a kind of collective guilt coming to the Russian people. That was, collective guilt, that was the term used by the philosopher Karl Jaspers after World War II. And he was talking about the German guilt. I'm not saying that all, of course, the Russian or the German are guilty of crimes legally. Many of them are, certainly hundreds of thousands are. Us must be brought to court as well. But I mean, that's a kind of moral guilt. And I think it's quite important that the people understand that, of course, all the crimes were committed, on their name. And that if they do not understand this kind of guilt, if they not understand, of course, all the crimes committed all through the history, of course, with Putin, before with Stalin, with the communist regime, if you do not understand all this kind of thing, they will never become, and I don't know if they will, in fact, they will never become a kind of liberal and democratic society. Just to come back to an element which is very important, I don't know if you remember, there was a speech delivered by the former German president, Richard von Weizsäcker, on May 8, 1985. And he said, well, there was something which was a kind of benediction. And the benediction for Germany was that we were defeated by the Allies. And I just consider that, will we have, in 40 years from now, a Russian president able to say, well, we were defeated by the Allies, thank God. Because otherwise, we would have never learned. And I think we have to fully defeat Russia. And that's why I am very skeptical about, the stance of part of the Russian opposition who try to say, well, that's only Putin as a guys and basically not the good Russians. No, there is, not saying that there are some good Russians. There are a tiny minority of Russians who are basically creating memorials for the victim of Bucha, Izium, or Mariupol. a very tiny minority. Yes, of course, this minority must be praised like the Weiße Rose, in Germany, this movement of resistance to Nazism.
Yeah.
But that's a very tiny minority. Otherwise, I mean, most of the Russian people are completely indifferent to the crimes
And
committed.
complacent,
They
yeah.
don't want don't want to see them. They want to turn a blind eye to the crimes, which is not acceptable.
Yeah, and the Russian opposition is basically it's kind of same thing, different font. It's the same imperialism, it's just in a different font. I always say that Russian opposition doesn't want to defeat Putin because they want to defeat his ideology. They want to defeat Putin because they want to be Putin. They don't see their responsibility. They absolutely don't want to change Russia. They don't see the faults within Russia, the colonization of minorities in Russia. It's, I mean, it could, we could have this conversation for days, probably nonstop, without taking a break. If we start talking about the Russian imperialism and Russian opposition, it's personally a very, I am very interested and have a lot of strong opinions on this subject. But I guess my last question would be: how can Ukrainians appeal to the French public more in order to help them understand what's going on here and what we are fighting against better?
Well, I think that you have in France already many people trying to be their voices. Of course, myself, but also some others, and I think that's quite important. Of course, to communicate more. About not only what the Ukrainian people are experiencing day after day. One of my duty, for instance, like many Ukrainians, is to speak day after day about the crimes committed, to show also the faces, to tell about the story of all the victims. And sometimes when you're very young victims, 1 year old, 2 year old, 10 years old, a very young woman, young man, etc. And I think that's to show, I mean, the immensity of crimes. And of course, I think that the advocacy can come about also through emotion, not emotion because emotion is superficial. No, emotion expresses something which is the truth about what we call sometimes geopolitics. Because I mean the crimes are speaking volumes about the intent of Russia. For instance, I was one of the rare voices, in France in 2018, asking for the boycott of the World Cup in Russia. There were only two people in France. It was the Green leaders, Yannick Jadot and myself. And I think it's quite important that the Ukrainians also provide us, not to me, I mean, but also to the French society, more elements, daily elements about the crimes. The second thing is what I was just saying before about the literature, just to show that Ukrainians, but I think that the French public is beginning to understand that Ukraine is not part of Russia. Yeah. Ukrainian society is a different society. Ukrainian society. Well, I'm going to Ukraine. I mean, I went to Ukraine more than 20 times since 20 years. But I know that the Ukrainian society is a European society, unlike Russia. So I think it's quite important to better communicate about the fact that Ukraine is different from Russia. That's not the same world. That's not the same universe. Because I remember, I had a lot of hearings, in the parliament because of my job, and I remember, in the parliament, you have a lot of MPs or senators saying, well, it was in the late 2010s. Well, basically, Ukraine is part of Russia, is that the same world? And I said, no, it's not the same world. And I think we have to communicate about that.
Yeah.
I think people understand and they accept, for instance, which is completely good, the fact that Ukraine must join the EU, will join NATO certainly as well, because, not only of the war, but because of its own political will and culture. And maybe that's the third thing that, of course, we have to talk about during the next coming years, about the fact that Ukraine membership to the EU won't endanger the well-being and also the revenues and the purchasing power of the other countries, European farmers, industrialists, tech, truck drivers, etc. We have to show that it will be a good advantage to have Ukraine, into the EU. Because I know that the propaganda, and I remember I wrote many pieces of that, in January and February, you had a lot of farmers protesting, especially, in France, in the Netherlands, and in Poland. And many of those farmers, that's something that I was able to observe, were influenced by the Russian propaganda.
Of course.
Saying, you see, when you will have Ukraine, in the EU, that will be very bad for you, the farmers, so you have to oppose Ukraine, etc. So I think there must be very concrete arguments to show that will be a plus for the European farmers and the European other, of course, professional activities. And I think in the coming years, that will be a joint effort from Ukraine and the UA, and the EU on this very point.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for having such an in-depth conversation with me. It really did help me learn a lot more about the dynamics within France, and I really hope that our viewers are going to learn a lot from this too, and I really hope to have a conversation with you in the future again.
It will be my pleasure. Thank you very much for your interview.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned a lot from it. I certainly did. Normally, we set things on fire by trying to eliminate fires with these conversations, but I think today and in the previous episodes, we actually put out some fires, and we have learned a lot of new, very interesting information that gives us a lot of insight into the dynamics in these European countries. If you would like to hear more conversations like it with very interesting experts like today, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Also give this video a like, share it with a friend who also might enjoy it, because you never know. And of course, leave your questions, suggestions, and constructive criticism in the comments, because I read all of it. Sometimes I even like it, and sometimes I even respond, because I'm very curious and I would like to know what you think. Till next time.